Hello and welcome to the Orthodox Oasis. My name is Jerome Hieronymus, and what you're about to watch is a VOD of the Orthodox Oasis over on Twitch. So feel free to join us live as we play games, hang out, and chat about Orthodox stuff. Otherwise, enjoy this VOD and we'll see you soon. Have a great day. This is good. Let's see here. Alaska Part 2.
Hi, this is Bill Marianis, host of the live call-in.
The Orthodox Church is the historical church, the church of holy tradition. And those who count themselves as Orthodox Christians share a uniquely historical consciousness, understanding that the saints, priests, and Orthodox laymen of the past play a crucial part in their journeys toward salvation. However, there is one area of Orthodox history that very few of us know anything about: the story of Orthodoxy in the Americas.
Don't know why I did that, but I did it.
Is thus happy to present American Orthodox History with Matthew Namey. Matthew is a writer and lecturer specializing in early American Orthodoxy and the Associate Director of the Society for Orthodox Christian History in the Americas.
Welcome back to American Orthodox History. This is Matthew Namey, and in our last episode, we spoke about the early history of Orthodoxy in Alaska, focusing on the 18th century and the early part of the 19th century. And today we're going to continue that discussion, and we have with us, again, as a guest, Eric Peterson. Eric, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
And Eric, first of all, when we stopped right around the point when St. Innocent arrived in Alaska. And so can you tell us a little bit about St. Innocent and sort of how he came to Alaska?
Well, St. Innocent grew up in Siberia in a city called Irkutsk. And it was there that he first heard stories about Alaska from hunters that had been hunting there and living there. And they would come back to Irkutsk, and then he probably heard about the missions that were also going on in Alaska. And since in Siberia there were also missions going on for the last 200 years in that area, he was familiar with missionary activity at the time that he went to seminary.
His name, I understand, was not Innocent at the time.
No, he was originally born with the name Popov, but it was a common name, so he was given the name of, I think it was the Archbishop of Irkutsk, which was Veniaminov.
And that was his last name. His first name was Father John, and Father John was a married priest originally.
That's right. He was a married priest, and he went to Alaska with his wife and family.
And this is not necessarily his wife's first choice.
Probably not. It was a long ways away, and it was a difficult journey, and they were far from their families, and didn't really go to see them again.
So Father John and his family go to Alaska, and he arrives and tell me, were there a lot of other churchmen there, a lot of other clergy, or how did that work?
He was the first permanent clergyman in Alaska since the death of the last one, which was probably, well, since St. Herman wasn't a priest, the last priest was probably Father Macari, who died when Bishop Yoasaf and the others sank at the sea, the ship sank.
So it had been some time since a priest had even been to Alaska, and there were still Alaskan people who were Orthodox, who were maintaining their faith despite the lack of clergy. And into this situation comes St. Innocent. And was he priest of just one church, or how did his ministry work?
Well, he was based on the island of Unalaska, which is sort of in the middle of the Aleutian chain. But that was his whole parish. I mean, it was from Unalaska all the way over to Sitka, and it was several thousand miles, open water, mountainous terrain, and very isolated congregations of people.
So we're talking about an extraordinarily large parish.
That's correct.
And St. Innocent, Father John, doing this work, what sort of work did he do? What were his accomplishments?
Well, one of the main things that he had to do when he got there was to do chrismations and give communion to people because they hadn't had a priest for those sacraments.
And these people, many of them had been baptized by lay people.
That's right. They were baptized by their fathers, godfathers, or whoever was the head person in the village, because there was no priest.
And St. Innocent, he performs these baptisms, does these sacraments, and he was also doing things that we don't necessarily associate with a priest.
Yes, he was translating services, he was building churches, and he was going out and preaching as well.
So tell us, first of all, about his translation work.
Well, he did translations into the native languages, into Aleut, and into a little bit into Tlingit. But he would go and he would learn the language. It would take him several years. He would then work on translating things from the Gospels, and also he wrote a catechism. It was the first original work in Aleut language.
And he didn't just write in Aleut, he invented the Aleut alphabet, correct?
That's right, he invented the alphabet just in the same tradition as St. Cyril and Methodius, and just like in Georgia and Armenia, where when Christianity came to those areas, they developed an alphabet.
And St. Innocent, besides his linguistic work, you say he was building churches. He wasn't just building them in the sense of overseeing the building of a church as the priest. He was doing a lot more than that.
Right, he was probably the chief laborer in the construction.
He was more than just a clergyman then. He had a lot of technical know-how.
Yes, he was sort of a Renaissance man in Alaska. I mean, he knew how to fix things. He knew how to put things together. He also knew the services, and he knew how to teach people about their faith.
And give us sort of an idea of his technical expertise.
Well, there was a time when he was visiting in California, and he had learned Latin in seminary, which he didn't really enjoy doing. Why would I learn Latin? There's no one to converse with. Until he met this group of Spanish friars, these Franciscans, and they didn't have any other language except Latin to converse in. So they were talking, and they developed a kind of friendship, and he built them a barrel organ, because that's one of the things he knew how to build, that he had built in Siberia. And so then they reused it, and they were playing Russian folk music, and they thought it was liturgical music. Maybe that's what he wrote in his journals, that he thought it might be. They had made a mistake.
and so he also was physically overseeing the building of his cathedral.
That's right. The cathedral in Sitka was built, and he had the oversight of the construction.
So St. Innocent, and he wasn't alone in his labors. He did eventually have some assistants, and one of those assistants is also a saint, not as well known, St. Jacob. Can you tell us a little bit about St. Jacob, his background, and what he did?
Well, St. Jacob was what would be called a Creole. His father was Russian, and his mother was an Aleutian Islander. He was born on the island of Atka, and later he went to seminary in Siberia and was ordained a priest, and then became the first parish priest on the island of Atka. He was roughly contemporary with St. Innocent at the same time. He served the western Aleutian Islands, which went all the way from, where Alaska ends, to the islands north of Japan, called the Kurils. Commander Islands. The Commanders were part of the diocese, maybe.
Now, St. Jacob was assisting St. Innocent not just in his work as a pastor, but he was also doing some translating as well. Is that right?
Yes, he helped translate the Gospel of St. Matthew into the Fox Aleut dialect, and also provided some notes to St. Innocent and help with his translation work.
Now, when these priests, St. Innocent, Father John, and Saint, or then Father Jacob, they were operating without a lot of oversight from the bishops back home. There were communication issues that today we wouldn't even conceive of.
That's right. The bishop being so far away, he still wanted to keep track of what was going on in the parishes of his clergy. And so each of the priests would have to keep a diary of what they did and what went on. And sometimes there's more than one diary. There's a diary dealing with general travel, their missionary work, and maybe a diary dealing with what things they did for children, a diary.
I was so wrong by that.
Measures of who was brought into the church, who died, money that was collected.
And communicating back with the bishop over in Russia was very difficult. It could take a very long time. And if I recall, there's a particular anecdote from St. Innocent's life that sort of illustrates this.
Yes, it's an anecdote that illustrates a lot of different things. When he was visiting for the first time the island of Umnak, he was met by a large crowd of people on the shore. And they said, "Welcome, Father John, we've been expecting you." And he thought, well, this is strange, because I didn't send anything on to them to let them know I was coming. So they said, well, he asked them, how do you know that I was coming? And they said, well, our shaman told us.
And shaman, for the native Alaskans, would be sort of like a witch doctor?
A witch doctor, a medicine man, someone who is a spiritual leader of the group. So St. Innocent said, well, can I meet this man? He said, okay, we'll show you where he lives. And so he met him, and the man's name was John Smirnikov. And Smirnikov, it turns out, had been baptized earlier by one of the priests of the Balam mission who was visiting the island. And so he was a Christian, but he didn't have anybody to show him anything about the faith, to teach him. So God appointed that there be two angels that would visit him. And so they taught him everything he wanted to know, and also through him, the angels would heal people on the island and would take care of them.
And so they were the ones who told this John Smirnikov that Innocent was coming.
That's right. They said that there will be a priest arriving on such and such a day. This is his name, and listen to what he tells you.
So did St. Innocent, did Father John get to meet these angels?
Well, he had asked permission of Blessed John if he could meet the angels, and Smerenikov asked the angels if Father John could meet them, and he says, why does he want to meet us? Because they were sent by gods. But Father John didn't know this. He was trying to determine if these angels were real angels, or if they were fancy, or if they were demons.
And so he didn't get to meet them. What was the problem?
Well, he had written to his bishop asking for permission if he could. And then in a year later, the permission came back, and the bishop wrote and said, well, by all means, try and meet the angels. But by that time, John Smerenikov had died, so the angels weren't appearing anymore.
So it took a year for him to get communication from his bishop.
That's right. A year was probably the average. Sometimes more. It depends on if a ship came to pick up the mail.
So this is sort of reinforcing the fact that Alaska was very, very isolated, and the laity continuing to have a major role with only a couple of priests.
That's correct. I mean, St. Innocent spent a lot of time working with the laity, especially with the chief of the village, somebody who would be respected, and he would spend time talking to them, and then they would tell the people what he said and lead the services.
And so eventually things becoming a bit simpler when St. Innocent became a bishop. How did that come about? He was a married priest.
Right. His wife died, and while he was away, I believe, and then when he was in Russia, he was made a bishop after a certain period of time. He was tonsured as a monk, and then they consecrated him as a bishop. Not by his own request, but that's what they decided would be the best, with help of the emperor. The emperor said, well, he looks like a good prospect for a bishop to me. So.
And so he went back to Alaska, and when he arrives, he's no longer Father John, he's Bishop Innocent.
That's correct. And he goes and he works on his cathedral at Sitka and builds the bishop's house, which still stands to this day.
And St. Innocent in Alaska for quite some time, and this sort of takes us up into the 1860s, I believe.
That's right. I believe that he went back to Siberia because he did more missionary work there after Alaska. Alaska was in a way evangelized prior to some parts of Siberia. But toward the end of the 19th century, mid-19th century, the Russian church was creating new dioceses in Alaska. And so they had elected St. Innocent to be archbishop of a diocese that would cover eastern Siberia and Alaska, which was the largest Orthodox archdiocese in history.
And then in 1867, a major event takes place, the sale of Alaska by the Russian Empire to the United States of America.
That's right. The Russians were sort of losing interest in Alaska. The fur trade was declining. There wasn't as much call for furs, much demand in the world. So they kind of packed up and sold to the United States for as much.
Can I help you, cockatrice? Oh, that's so far back. Come on.
Money as they could get. And then the churches were sort of left. They were still funded by the government, but there was sort of a decision of what to do with the mission.
Now, St. Innocent, his idea was, let's send in English-speaking clergy and sort of spread the mission into the United States itself. That didn't really happen. It remained an Alaskan mission.
That's right. It remained an Alaskan mission for, well, at least 50 years. But St. Innocent was a very forward-thinking man.
And so we've sort of gone up from about 1824 up to 1867, and in the following decades, a lot of changes took place in Alaska. And I think it might be a good time to pause here and move on in our next episode to discuss this very tumultuous, in many ways tragic period in Alaskan Orthodox history, the period that followed the sale of Alaska to the United States.
You've been listening to American Orthodox History with Matthew Namey.
Very good. I think one more part. Yep. All right, Alaska Part 3. Let's go.
Hi, this is Bill.
The Orthodox Church is the historical church, the church of holy tradition. And those who count themselves as Orthodox Christians share a uniquely historical consciousness, understanding that the saints, priests, and Orthodox laymen of the past play a crucial part in their journeys toward salvation. However, There is one area of Orthodox history that very few of us know anything about: the story of Orthodoxy in the Americas. Ancient Faith Radio is thus happy to present American Orthodox History with Matthew Namey. Matthew is a writer and lecturer specializing in early American Orthodoxy and the Associate Director of the Society for Orthodox Christian History in the Americas.
Welcome back to American Orthodox History. This is Matthew Namey, and in the past couple episodes, we've been speaking with Eric Peterson about the history of Orthodoxy in Alaska. And the last episode, we got all the way up to about 1867, which is when the United States government purchased Alaska from the Russian Empire. And this is sort of a major watershed moment in Alaskan Orthodox history. And we'll just start there. Eric is back with us again today, and we'll pick up there in 1867. What happened after the sale of Alaska?
Well, with regard to Orthodoxy in Alaska, 1867 marked sort of the opening of the floodgates for non-Orthodox missionaries to come in and work with the native people.
So you were talking about American Protestant groups for the most part?
For the most part, Protestant. There were a couple Catholics, a few Episcopalians, but for the most part, Protestant, Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist.
And the Russian Orthodox Church at this point in 1867, still in Alaska and still being funded, correct?
Right, it was still funded by the Russian government until the revolution.
And these American missionaries come in, and it's not just American missionaries coming in, correct? It's also American colonists.
Yes, Americans were the first to colonize Alaska. The Russians just stayed there for a little bit for trade. I should mention before that funding was not just like put on a plate by the government given to the mission in Alaska, but it was also had to be raised by the native Alaskans themselves for their churches. They were the ones responsible for building the churches and for supporting the priests in some way. I mean, they were supplemented by the government.
So the Alaskan mission, the Orthodox mission in Alaska, was not just a government operation. It was from the ground up as well.
Hey!
And then these Americans come in.
Those things are
and
evil.
What happens? What happened when the Americans took over?
Well, you have kind of a mass confusion. The Americans were coming in for two purposes: to Christianize and to civilize. Civilize meaning making the people they thought of as these kind of wild individuals into white Americans. So they didn't really see a distinction between the two. I mean, you couldn't be a Christian and be kind of like one of these wild natives.
And that dichotomy not necessarily existing with the Orthodox. You could be Orthodox
Vampire
and
girl.
Native Alaskan. That not really the case with the Americans.
That's right. The Orthodox had a very long tradition of respecting cultures that they came in contact with vis-a-vis Orthodoxy. They didn't try to Russify these new peoples. There were isolated attempts, but overall, you had basically in Alaska, for example, a very small group of clergy working for the most part with a large group of natives and with the help of indigenous leaders. So you didn't have these kind of complexes that developed that you can beat down the native culture and say, oh, all that, your language is pagan, your culture is pagan, so we have to get rid of all that. And so you have to adopt a Christian language, English, and an American Christian culture.
And this is what the Americans were doing. And how did they go about doing this, practically speaking?
Well, practically speaking, it was through a series of things, one of which, probably the most destructive to the culture was, to the native cultures, was the residential boarding schools, where they would take children with or without parental permission. Sometimes the parents would think, it'll be good for the kids, they didn't really know what was going on. So they would take them to the boarding house, and then they would be instructed in American culture, in Protestantism, and sort of the things of civilization. And then they weren't allowed, in most cases, to go back and see their parents, because then they would be speaking their native language again and hearing about their cultural stories and about Orthodoxy, all of which were anathema to the Protestant missionaries.
So the Protestant missionaries viewed Orthodoxy as sort of part and parcel with the native identity altogether.
Yes, I think they thought of Orthodoxy as part of the problem. I don't think they thought of Orthodox as heathen, but they were sort of close. I mean, they were sort of Christian, but they weren't civilized enough for them, because they allowed the natives to speak their own language, and they allowed certain cultural things to go on. And sometimes it was just because there were very few Orthodox clergy, so that you couldn't really enforce things. So certain things like native dancing went on, and other rituals connected to culture, which originally had a religious meaning. And then over about a century, then there was a transition that these things which had a religious meaning for the natives then became to have a cultural meaning.
And so the American missionaries, Protestant missionaries, didn't recognize this. And we should point out, too, that this was not something that was simply facilitated by the American government. It was something the American government was very much involved in.
Yes, it was what the American government wanted. They wanted civilization, because previously in the continental states, they were involved in various wars with Indians, and there was a push against this, that having a civilizing program would be more humane. So it was like a different approach to what they saw as the problem of trying to bring these native peoples under American rule.
And there was one man in particular who was especially notorious, at least in the eyes of the Orthodox, for his zealous efforts to Americanize and sort of Protestantize the Alaskan natives.
Yes, although I would say that probably more nuanced approach would be more accurate. But Sheldon Jackson was the director of educational efforts in Alaska for the native peoples. And so it was his vision, basically, as a kind of a humanitarian effort. Instead of exterminating native peoples like they were doing in the lower 48, and instead of either or just ignoring them and hope they'll go away, his approach was to educate and to make them into Americans so that they would be more accepted in society.
And to do this, the Sheldon Jackson and the U.S. government essentially divided up Alaska into parts.
Right. Each major Protestant group took a section. The Catholics got something very small, and the Orthodox didn't get anything. Of course, the Orthodox were all over Alaska, but they didn't want the Orthodox being part of it because they didn't view them as being civilized or very Christian.
We're talking here about the latter part of the 19th century, and kind of take us into the 20th century. What was it like being an Alaskan Orthodox person there, and what was church life like in this very difficult period?
Well, there were many different trials that they had to go through. The Russian priests the Orthodox priests were like protectors of the native people, again, just like they were in the early period in the Valam mission. Here they were in this later period with the Protestant missionaries. And there were cases where an Orthodox person would have died after being in a Protestant boarding school and would be refused a funeral, Orthodox funeral. They wouldn't let the Orthodox have the body. And there were other, more horrible cases than this. So the priests had to be constant advocates, going through whatever means they could. Sometimes they were successful, a lot of times they weren't. And there were some issues of people leaving the Orthodox Church either through intimidation or through maybe a promise of advancement socially. But there was also kind of the other side of this, was that native peoples who had previously been opposed to the evangelization work that was done during the Russian period by the Orthodox missionaries then saw the alternative, which was the Protestant missionaries that wanted to get rid of their culture, and they embraced Orthodoxy because the Orthodox let them keep their culture.
So some of these native tribes would make the choice, well, I get we could be overrun by the Protestants, or we could look to the Orthodox who will actually respect us. Right,
and these were very traditional, conservative people who normally lived in rural areas. There were, of course, native peoples that became Protestant because they were interacting more with Americans, and it was a way to get ahead and become more civilized, you'd be accepted. But the people that wanted to keep their culture, by and large, became Orthodox.
And so, in a way, we've been sort of phrasing, I've been phrasing this period as a period of trial, but in some respects, there was some triumph for the Orthodox, despite the difficulty.
That's correct. It was a period of confusion, but also of growth.
Growth? How do you mean by that?
Well, with the different peoples coming into the church, primarily amongst the Tlingits, there was a growth in numbers, but there's also growth in spiritual depth, because then it was not just, either thinking about the past, shamanism, but also thinking about the other influence other spiritual directions that people could take. And so people began to be rooted more in orthodoxy, and orthodoxy became indigenized in the native culture.
So this really is the time period, this late 19th, early 20th century, when the Protestant missionaries were working as hard as they could to make these native Alaskans Protestant. It was in this time period that the native Alaskans were more sort of concretely embracing orthodoxy as something that was a part of who they were.
That appears to be the case, because it takes a long time for, in certain cultural climates in the world, for people to embrace orthodoxy collectively, well, even for an individual. But there are certain cases in Alaska, particularly amongst the Tlingits, where you could look at it as a way that they had a period of syncretism, where they had their old shamanism and then orthodoxy, and then it sort of worked itself out as what had been spiritual symbols and understandings that became cultural. So then your new spiritual understanding and symbols were ones of orthodoxy, Christianity.
And then we get sort of through the early part of the 20th century, and in 1917, we all know 1917, a major moment in Orthodox history in general with the Russian Revolution, and this had a major impact on Orthodoxy in Alaska.
That's correct. Basically, the funding was gone from the Russian government, and there was also some of the Russian priests either had to leave or stay. So many of them left. Some of them ended up not being able to get back to Russia, and some of them that went back were martyred.
And the natives in this period, the native Orthodox in Alaska, remaining Orthodox, would you say the Protestant missionaries after 1917 were as vigorous as they were before, or how were the dynamics in this post-1917 period?
I would say the issue with the Protestants continued. It wasn't until, I believe, the 60s or 70s that several of these groups, like the Presbyterians, apologized for what they had done to the native peoples. But I think that the general dynamics changed in the Orthodox mission in Alaska, that you had even greater reliance on the native peoples themselves. And so you had more native clergy. This was especially the case on the Yukon Delta, which after St. Jacob died was basically entirely Creole or entirely native clergy that were serving that area. It took a bit longer in the Tlingit area for there to be native clergy, but you had stories of native missionaries now, or Creole missionaries that had been Orthodox for generations, then now doing mission work, now taking over the work of the diocese, visiting parishes. And in that way, Alaska, even though it has its own diocese and more churches, has funding this day, is still a missionary diocese. There's still parishes that don't have full-time priests, and so they have a priest that comes every once in a while, but then you have to keep the services going on in church, so you rely on readers.
So it seems to me, and my area of particular study has typically been Orthodoxy, the history of Orthodoxy in the lower 48, but we see, I think a common thread in Alaska of this, compared to the rest of the Orthodox world, a rather heavy reliance on lay people to keep the life of the church functioning.
That's right, because the lay people are the local church, and then the priest is sort of his local church is much larger than the what would be the parish. So he would have several parishes to visit, which is also the case in several places in Russia, in more rural areas.
And also in the United States in this early period, really contemporaneous with this Alaskan period that we've been talking about, late 19th, early 20th century that we've been talking about today. A similar case in the lower 48, the itinerant priests sort of going from town to town and taking care of pockets of Orthodox as they find them. We find the same thing in Alaska.
That's right. You have the priest that takes care of what the priest can take care of, but then it's the people that he appoints, the bishop, tonsures, in that smaller parish that take care of the daily life of the church.
And so as we come to a close, I think it's interesting to see, Alaskan Orthodoxy, clearly its own distinct phenomenon. It's very, very obviously, to me at least, something that is distinctive among the Orthodox, in the Orthodox world. Has its own cultural characteristics, its own very unique history, and yet we see some common threads that tie it to Orthodoxy in America, and show both in Alaska and in America that this tenacity of the laity that we sort of have to rely upon them to keep the church going, to make sure that the people remain Orthodox. This is a lay effort in a lot of respects, both in Alaska and in the lower 48.
It's a very instructive case.
I'd like to thank you, Eric, for being our guest, Eric Peterson. And as we move on, as we discuss Orthodoxy in the lower 48, let's keep in mind the interesting and important similarities that it has and debts that it has to Alaska.
You've been listening
that was really
to
interesting,
American
actually.
Orthodox History with Matthew Namey.
That was really good. That was different part of American history I did not know about. All right. Next episode is 25 minutes. Ooh. Let's see here. This is Father Raphael Morgan. This was delivered at the Ancient Faith Christianity and African American Conference. That's why it's longer. It's a speech. This is about the first Black Orthodox priest.
Hi, this is Bill Merrick.
Let's go.
The Orthodox Church is the historical church.
Which was the official tradition.
The Orthodox Church is the historical church. The church
No.
of tradition. And those who count themselves as Orthodox Christians share a uniquely historical consciousness, understanding that the saints, priests, and Orthodox laymen of the past play a crucial part in their journeys toward salvation. However, there is one area of Orthodox history that very few of us know anything about: the story of Orthodoxy in the Americas. Ancient Faith Radio is thus happy to present American Orthodox History with Matthew Namey. Matthew is a writer and lecturer specializing in early American Orthodoxy and the Associate Director of the Society for Orthodox Christian History in the Americas.
I'm here today to speak about one of the most interesting figures in American Orthodox history. But rather than simply telling you his life story in chronological order, I thought I might first tell you how I initially encountered him. Now, several years ago, I was poking around in the St. Vladimir's Seminary Library in New York, and I was looking for material on a man named Father Ingram Irvine, who was an early American convert to Orthodoxy. And I was paging through some old English language sections of a publication called the Vestnik, the Russian Orthodox American Messenger, which was the official newsletter of the Russian Orthodox Church in America. And in one of these issues, which was the October-November 1904 issue, I noticed a letter by a man named Robert Josias Morgan. And this man, Morgan, was apparently an Episcopal deacon who had recently visited Russia and wrote a letter talking about his experience and how much he enjoyed his trip. And I thought pretty little of it at the time, but fortunately I made a photocopy. And then I thought it might be useful at some point in the future. And then I completely forgot all about Robert Josias Morgan. A few months after this, I was searching an online newspaper archive looking for information about St. Raphael of Brooklyn, the Arab Orthodox saint. And I did a search for Raphael and Orthodox Church or something like that. And I came up with a bunch of results from a Jamaican newspaper from 1913. And this struck me as odd. So I clicked on the first one, and on my screen appeared a remarkable sight, and this is what I saw. On the front cover of the newspaper was the photo of a black man dressed in black clothing, wearing a clerical collar and a pectoral cross, and beneath the photo, the headline read, "Priest's Visit, Father Raphael of Greek Orthodox Church." Needless to say, I was shocked. Who was this priest? What was his story? And why hadn't I heard about him before? It's taken me many years to piece together the story of Father Raphael And even now there are huge gaps.
Ooh.
One non-Orthodox writer who was commenting on Father Raphael in the 1970s wrote, "The Morgan story is so utterly improbable that one tends to dismiss it as a hoax. But I promise you, this is not a hoax." Robert Josias Morgan was born in Jamaica in the 1860s.
Sword, shield,
early
excellent.
1870s.
8-8.
In other words,
Oh.
either during or
Very
just after
good.
the American Civil War. I can't pin his birth date down any more precisely than that. He never met his father, who died when Robert was still in the womb. And at an early age, Morgan embarked on an amazing and inexplicable life of travel. I have no idea how he financed his journeys. First, he went to Panama and Honduras, then to the United States. For a while, he was a missionary in Germany, of all places. He made multiple visits to England, and at some point along the way, he became a minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And then eventually, he joined the Church of England. He went to Sierra Leone in Africa, where he studied Greek and Latin at an Anglican school, and then became a lay reader and worked as a missionary in Liberia for a number of years. Eventually, he made another visit to America and then returned to England, where he studied to become an Episcopal deacon. He then returned to America again and was ordained an Episcopal deacon, and this took place in 1895. And he served all over the United States, in the eastern part of the United States, Delaware, Charleston, Richmond, Nashville, and finally Philadelphia. At some point around the turn of the 20th century, Morgan began to question his Anglican faith. For 3 years, he studied Anglicanism, Roman Catholicism, and Orthodoxy on his own, trying to determine which one was the true church. As one early profile puts it, it was his final conviction that the Holy Greek Orthodox Catholic and Apostolic Church is the pillar and ground of truth. But he didn't become Orthodox right away after he'd come to this conclusion. He first went on a trip to Russia, and that was the trip that I mentioned earlier, and he visited the churches and the monasteries of Russia. He was present at an anniversary service for Tsar Nicholas II's coronation. He also attended a memorial service for Tsar Alexander III, and while he was in Russia, he was treated as a special guest of the Tsar. And his picture reportedly appeared in numerous Russian periodicals. He was treated as an honored guest. And in this letter that he wrote after the trip, he said, "I came as a simple tourist, chiefly with the object to see the churches and monasteries of this country and to hear the ritual and the service of the Holy Orthodox Church. And I am perfectly satisfied with everything I saw and witnessed." He then continued his travels, going to places like Turkey, Cyprus, and the Holy Land. But he still didn't become Orthodox. He spent another 3 years studying with Greek priests in America, preparing for baptism. Now, this raises an immediate question. What was he doing with the Greeks and not the Russians? You have to understand, Orthodoxy in America at this time was rather chaotic. This was the beginning of the 20th century, and the Greeks in America were very disorganized. They had no bishops. They had no real national structure, no seminaries, no places of education. Practically speaking, most parishes functioned as little autonomous units run by boards of trustees. And they were pretty much exclusively for Greek immigrants. Now, contrast this with the Russians. The Russians had a bishop, St. Tikhon, who was well known among the Anglicans. Right around this time, in 1904, the Russians established their first seminary in America, in Minneapolis. And generally speaking, the Russians were pretty well organized. And again, right around this time, in 1905, a man named Ingram Irvine, who was a former Episcopal priest, converted to Orthodoxy in the Russian church. So the obvious thing for Morgan to do would have been to join the Russians, but he didn't, and I have no idea why. It's possible that he just got to know the Greeks in Philadelphia personally and just liked them. And in any event, he was in Philadelphia and he was affiliated with the Greek church. In January 1906, Morgan was present at the Christmas liturgy of the Greek church in Philadelphia. And keeping in mind, this was before the new calendar came to the Greek church. and the Greeks celebrated Christmas on January the 7th. Anyway, the Philadelphia Inquirer reported the next day that the Reverend R.J. Morgan of the American Catholic Church, an offshoot of the Protestant Episcopal Church, assisted. The following summer, in 1907, Morgan sailed to Istanbul. He was armed with 2 letters. One of them was from the Philadelphia Greek priest, a man named Father Demetrios Petrides. And Petrides recommended that Morgan be baptized and then ordained an Orthodox priest. There was also a letter from the Philadelphia Greek community which supported Morgan's ordination and even said that if he failed to establish a black parish, which was his hope, that he would be welcome to serve as an assistant priest at the Philadelphia Greek Church. So Morgan arrived in Istanbul, and he was interviewed by a Metropolitan Joachim of Pelagonia, who was one of the few bishops of the Ecumenical Patriarchate who had a knowledge of English. Metropolitan Joachim recommended that Morgan be baptized, chrismated, ordained, and then sent back to America to, and I quote, carry the light of the Orthodox faith among his racial brothers. And so in August, Morgan was baptized in front of 3,000 people, and on the Feast of the Dormition, he was ordained a priest. He took the name Father Raphael in place of Robert, and the Ecumenical Patriarchate then sent him back to America with vestments, liturgical books, a cross, and 20 pounds sterling. He was given the right to hear confessions, but the Holy Synod denied his request for an antimencion and holy chrism. So their intention was for him to be attached to the Philadelphia parish, but to be a missionary for blacks in America. As soon as Father Raphael arrived back in America, he baptized his wife and his children. Now, here's something odd. He baptized his family immediately upon his return, probably in the fall of 1907. But in 1911, he made a trip to Greece, and on the passenger manifest, as you can see, he's listed as single. Furthermore, the 1913 Jamaican newspaper article that I referred to earlier says that he is known in the world as Robert Josias Morgan. A couple years later, in the book Who's Who of the Colored Race, it says that the family name Morgan has been dropped and should never be used in addressing him. It certainly sounds to me like he became a monk at some point. And here's another odd thing. In numerous articles in the teens, the 19-teens, Morgan is referred to as the founder and superior of a religious fraternity called the Order of the Cross of Golgotha. I have absolutely no idea what this order was. I've found no other references to it except for the fact that Morgan was involved with it. And of course, you don't usually hear married priests referred to as founders and superiors of religious orders. Until recently, my suspicion was that Morgan's wife had died and that he had become a monk after being widowed. But several months ago, I discovered that Morgan's wife had actually filed for a divorce in 1909, citing cruelty and failure to support the couple's children. Now, I don't know what the story is behind this. I'm not quite sure what this means. And it certainly seems like in the wake of this, Morgan returned to Greece and was tonsured a monk. He was allowed to continue being a priest. And his wife ended up remarrying and retaining custody of their son Cyril. Now, the divorce documents still survive in the courthouse of Delaware County, Pennsylvania. And right now I'm trying to get copies of these documents, but the court is being rather difficult, even though this was a 100-year-old divorce case. So hopefully I will soon have copies and will be able to shed more light on Father Raphael's life. Anyway, moving on. Father Raphael appears to have made the Philadelphia Greek parish his base of operations, as I said. He went to Jamaica in 1913 and stayed there for several months into the year 1914. And he toured the island giving lectures on his travels and on the Holy Land and on similar sort of religious and geographical subjects. The most interesting event of his long trip to Jamaica took place in December of 1913 when a Russian warship stopped in Jamaica, and Father Raphael concelebrated the Divine Liturgy with the priest who was aboard the ship. A number of Syrian Jamaicans attended. There were a number of Syrians living in Jamaica that were Orthodox, and they attended this liturgy. And Father Raphael used English for their benefit. They knew English, they didn't know Russian, so he served in English for them. The next day, the newspaper reported that Father Raphael states that he is now in communication with the Syrian Orthodox Bishop of Brooklyn in regard to the Syrians here, and that he hopes before long something will be done in regard to their spiritual welfare. Now, the Syrian Orthodox Bishop of Brooklyn was St. Raphael Hawawini. I don't know if anything came of this communication. St. Raphael became ill the following year in 1914, and he died in February of 1915. And so it's possible, and I would think likely, that nothing ever came of this, that he was never able to do anything for these Syrians in Jamaica. And eventually, many of these Syrians and their descendants became Anglicans. But it's still notable that Father Raphael Morgan and St. Raphael Hawawini were in contact with one another. Father Raphael, as we remember, was a priest of the Greek Church, but he had no problem cooperating with the other Orthodox in America. Jurisdiction didn't seem to matter to him. In fact, there's even evidence that he had some sort of contact with the Russian cathedral in New York City. That passenger manifest that I referred to earlier, when he was returning to America from Greece, he actually listed his destination as being the Russian cathedral in New York City. So there's definitely evidence of some sort of contact between them. I have no idea why he was going there or what happened, but there was obviously some interaction. The last thing I've been able to find about Father Raphael is from 1916. Now, he was still in Philadelphia, and he and about a dozen other Jamaican Americans wrote a letter to the editors of the leading newspapers of Jamaica. They were complaining about Marcus Garvey, who was on a lecture tour in America. Now, this was the outset of Garvey's career, and I'm sure you're familiar with Marcus Garvey, black nationalist, founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and a leader in the Back to Africa movement. This was the very beginning of Garvey's career, and Morgan and Garvey did not see eye to eye with one another. Morgan felt that Garvey was stirring up racial tensions. And Garvey was apparently, according to Morgan, portraying race relations in Jamaica in a very unfavorable light. Father Raphael and his Jamaican-American friends were not happy about this, and in their letter they wrote that we, having attended his lectures, found them to be pernicious, misleading, and derogatory to the prestige of the government and the people of Jamaica. Now, Garvey, for his part, wrote a response and accused Father Raphael. He said that the letter was a concoction and a gross fabrication written as part of a conspiracy against him, led apparently by Father Raphael. And that's pretty much it. That's all that we have in the historical record. After the exchange with Marcus Garvey, Father Raphael seems to have just disappeared. It's a mystery. Paul Manolis, a Greek Orthodox historian who in the 1970s interviewed several elderly Greeks from Philadelphia. And one of these elderly Greeks said that she remembered sitting on Father Raphael's knee and being fed bananas. She also said that Father Raphael's daughter attended Oxford. I have not yet been able to verify this. One man said that Father Raphael spoke broken Greek and used English when he was serving the liturgy. Finally, there was a man named George Liakouras, and he told Paul Manolis that he remembered Father Raphael leaving to go to Jerusalem, never again to return after serving a few years with Father Petrides. There are so many unanswered questions. Did Father Raphael die in the late teens? Or did he really move to Jerusalem? Or perhaps did he return to Jamaica or some other place, maybe Africa? Did he remain Orthodox? And did he ever succeed in his mission to convert his fellow blacks to Orthodoxy? At first glance, his mission appears to have been a failure. Except for Father Raphael's own family, there's no evidence that he converted a single person. And the story would end there, but it doesn't. Not quite. It's possible that Father Raphael Morgan was indirectly responsible for the conversion of thousands of Africans to Orthodoxy. And here's how. The website of St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Richmond, Virginia, includes a list of previous pastors from the community's history. And lo and behold, Robert Josias Morgan is listed as being the rector of the parish for a short time in 1901. But this is very odd. He was just a deacon. You don't usually hear about deacons being rectors of parishes, right? The only explanation that I can think of is that this was an interim position, that the previous rector had left, and that for a short period of time, Father Raphael, at the time Reverend Morgan, was sort of holding down the fort until a permanent priest could be found. He was probably already the parish deacon, so it would have been a natural thing for him to take over overseeing the parish in the interim. The previous rector, with whom he almost certainly served, was a man named George Alexander Maguire, an Episcopal priest. Now, presumably, Morgan and Maguire knew one another. They were both black men from the Caribbean, and both were ordained at about the same time. They both served in Richmond, Virginia, and afterwards both served in Philadelphia. And frankly, there weren't that many black clergy in the Episcopal Church. It was a small world. They all pretty much knew each other. It's logical to think that they were acquainted.
The Fly.
So why is this a big deal? Who was George Alexander Maguire? The name may ring a bell. I'll tell you. Many years later, in 1920, George Maguire became a close associate of Marcus Garvey, the very same Marcus Garvey with whom Father Raphael had a disagreement just a few years before. And then in 1921, George Maguire was made a bishop by a certain Archbishop Joseph Vallate of the American Catholic Church. Now, you may remember that I mentioned that prior to becoming Orthodox, Father Raphael had briefly been a member of the American Catholic Church. It is the same church. Now, this Vallate was a kind of rogue bishop, a vagante bishop. You would call him, I suppose, an old Catholic, but he was some sort of schismatic mishmash of Episcopalian and Roman Catholic. He was on friendly terms with the Orthodox for several years, and as I said, Father Raphael was briefly in his church back in 1906, and then in 1921, Vallate consecrated George Maguire. And what did George Maguire do now that he was a bishop? Why, he founded a group called the African
really
Orthodox
unlikely.
Church. It wasn't Orthodox.
You find a Hildigas for no reason.
The trappings and language of Orthodoxy, but it wasn't in communion with any of the world's Orthodox.
Stalactite.
And it was
Stalactite.
with black nationalism.
Stalactite.
But it was Orthodox in name only. But it eventually spread to Africa itself. And after World War II, the branch of the African Orthodox Church, which was on the African continent, joined the Orthodox Patriarchate of Alexandria. Much of the flowering of Orthodoxy in Africa today, in places like Uganda and Kenya and Tanzania, can be traced to that original African Orthodox Church movement. It's sort of a mystery why George Maguire would have created an African Orthodox Church. After all, he was an Episcopal priest. Why would he want to become Orthodox? It is very, very likely, and I'm not the first person to suggest this, but it's very likely that Maguire got the idea to become Orthodox from Father Raphael Morgan. He certainly knew about Father Raphael, and he almost certainly knew Father Raphael personally. And who knows, it's possible that Father Raphael even tried to evangelize Maguire, thus planting the seed for Maguire to eventually look out for orthodoxy. And so now we really do come to the end of our story. It seems like there are nothing but questions about Father Raphael. I've raised more questions than I've answered. How did he manage to travel around the world so many times? How did he find out about orthodoxy? Why did he join the Greeks in America rather than with the Russians? Did he ever succeed in directly converting anyone besides his own immediate
The Fly
family
has
to
made
the
it
Orthodox faith?
to the other side between the window and the blinds.
What was the order of the Cross of Golgotha, and what happened with his with that order when Father Raphael was no longer around? And what happened to him? Did he really go to Jerusalem as that old Philadelphia Greek man suggested, or did something else happen? I can't answer any of these questions. Now, if any of you think that you could shed more light on this story of Father Raphael, please let me know. I would love to learn more about him, and I'm sure many of us would. But before we close, I would like to reflect for a moment on what Father Raphael's story means for us today. Now, The most obvious message of his life, at least in my opinion, is that the Orthodox faith is for everyone. It isn't just for cradle Orthodox, for people who were born into the faith. It's not even just for people you'd obviously think of as converts. I'm sure it seemed completely unlikely 100 years ago that a black man from Jamaica would become an Orthodox priest in Constantinople.
How'd you make it back
out?
As
far as I can tell, no one reached out to him. No one tried to share the faith with him. No one evangelized him. He came to this himself. He studied, he learned about Orthodoxy, he recognized it as a pearl of great price, and he sought after it. On the one hand, by his conversion, he continues to bear witness, even today, to the truth of the Orthodox faith. And on the other hand, he admonishes us to recognize that the Orthodox faith is for the whole world, not just the cradle.
That was rather easy.
Not just those converts who have been fortunate enough to find Orthodoxy themselves, and not just those friends and acquaintances of ours with whom we can conveniently share our faith. We must, as the church, be open at all times to all people. Father Raphael Morgan is an exemplary reminder of this important truth. Thank you.
You've been listening to American
That
Orthodox
was
History with
very interesting.
Matthew
Father
is a writer and
Raphael
lecturer
Morgan.
specializing in early American Orthodoxy and the Associate Director of the Society for Orthodox Christian History in the Americas.
Hey, thanks for watching. You can find more VODs here on YouTube, as well as other projects, including reviews of games I've played and movies I've watched. You could also stop by the channel, Orthodox Oasis, over on Twitch. Join us live, hang out, say hi, and all that good stuff. Otherwise, thanks for watching. This has been the Orthodox Oasis. My name is Jerome Hieronymus, and may the Lord bless you and keep you always. Bye.